Hi, it's Professor Moylan. This module deals with global trade. Here's a fascinating statistic for you. At the beginning of the 20th century, 10% of all business activity crossed a border. In other words, 90% of all business activity did not cross a border. It stayed within its home country. At the beginning of the 21st century, that number was 50%. Half of all business activity crosses a border. So global trade has increased dramatically. Why? Well, there are two major reasons. One is ability, and two is desire. Ability. It's a lot easier with current transportation methods to move things around and communication methods for the information to go around. But desire, more and more countries desire to have global trade. There's an increasing belief that global trade is good even locally. In other words, and you'll hear this saying a lot, a rising tide lifts all the boats. So if we participate in global trade, it will benefit us locally because it creates economic activity. Economic activity begets more economic activity, the multiplier effect, and so on and so on. Well, in this module, we cover the basics of global trade.
Global trade is when sales or trade occurs across a border. Lots of people are in favor of global trade, but not everybody, because there are pros and cons. Let's start with the pros, the benefits of globalization. Globalization expands economic freedom, it spurs competition, it increases productivity and thus living standards, it gives one country access to foreign capital, global export markets, and advanced technology, and promotes higher labor and environmental standards. So all those are great things. Who could possibly be against global trade? Well, here's some of the negatives of trade and globalization. From a U.S. standpoint, millions of Americans have lost their jobs, and millions more fear losing jobs. Many workers live with the threat of outsourcing if they don't accept pay cuts, and industries are vulnerable to operations, moving offshore. So there are the pros and cons. Now, here's the results of globalization. There have been consolidation of many national markets in one big world market, and there's been the development of two almost opposite kinds of international businesses, huge firms, and then small, quick, internet-enabled small firms. This has been spurred by the growth of e-commerce because it's very, very easy to sell globally when you are selling electronically on the internet. Now, to this point of one big market, free trade has spurred the global economy and created a global market. Imports is bringing goods into the country. Exports is sending things out of the country. From the U.S. standpoint, one of the huge benefits, positive effects of imports is lots and lots and lots of inexpensive goods. One of the huge positive effects of exports is U.S. firms doing well selling overseas. Think of companies like Apple, for example. Now, what are the negative effects? Well, usually it's things like local industries being hurt. That would be a major negative effect. Now, again, the different types of businesses that succeed, big businesses often do, and then small but very, very nimble, quick internet-enabled firms do as well. Balance of trade refers to the comparison of exports and imports. So you have a trade surplus if you export more than you import. You have a trade deficit if you import more than you export. Now again, surplus, you export more than you import. Deficit, you import more than you export. Take a guess. What does the U.S. have? A trade surplus or a trade deficit? Yeah, a trade deficit. Definitely a trade deficit. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Many people think that a trade deficit is a bad thing, but if you have a situation where you are importing things that you could create on your own if need be, but you simply choose not to, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And the types of things that the U.S. imports, shoes, clothing, electronics, those are all industries that used to be handled in the U.S., but allocation of resources, many people have decided that it would be better done elsewhere. If you are reliant on things that are critically important, but you can't create them yourselves, you have to import them, that can be a bad thing. Historically, the strategic thing that the U.S. was oftentimes reliant on imports was oil. That has become much less of an issue now. With regard to strategically important things, the U.S. tends to be able to control its own destiny. Food, medicine, scientific equipment, those are all things where U.S. has a trade surplus. Okay, let's take a look at the world economy, an overview, and there's that statistic that came up earlier. In the early 20th century, economic integration was at 10%. Today it is at 50%. If you look out over what's happened over the past 75 years or so, you could argue that the struggle between capitalism and socialism has almost ended. Capitalism has won. The internet really adds to the global economy. E-commerce diminishes the importance of national barriers and forces companies to reevaluate existing business models. Now, the 75-year struggle between capitalism and socialism has almost ended. Market capitalism is being embraced by more and more countries. In market capitalism, individuals and firms allocate the resources. Production resources are generally privately owned. Consumption decisions are driven by consumers, and the role of the government is to promote competition among firms and ensure consumer protection. But there are several variations on Western market systems. They tend to go by the names Anglo-Saxon, social market economy model, and the Nordic model. Now, the Anglo-Saxon model, that is what's going on in the U.S., Canada, Great Britain. There's private ownership, a lot of free enterprise. There's a minimal social safety net. With the social market economy model, there's private ownership, but there's government intervention in employment. There's much more inflexible employment. Now, that would be in countries like France, Germany, Italy. And then the so-called Nordic model, that's where there's real mix of state and private ownership, but a very, very large safety net. And that would be what's going on in Sweden and Norway. You can put countries into one of four categories, if you will, so-called low-income countries. And rule of thumb is they've got per capita GNP of, call it $1,000 or less, very limited industrialization, high percentage of population is engaged in farming. There tend to be high birth rates and low literacy rates, heavy reliance on foreign trade. What would be examples of these? Well, there's a concentration of these types of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, some of the former Soviet republics, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, would fall into this category as well. Low middle income countries, and let's call these GNP per capita of $1,000 to $4,000, but they are expanding. They've got rapidly expanding consumer markets. They do have cheap labor, so a lot of mature, standardized, labor-intensive industries have moved into them. These would be industries like footwear, textiles, toys. Among the so-called BRIC nations that would fall into this category are India and China. Upper middle income countries call this per capita GNP of $4,000 to $12,000. These are rapidly industrializing. They're moving from more of an agrarian economy to more of a manufacturing economy. Literacy rates and education levels are rising. They have higher wages than lower middle income countries, but still lower wages than more advanced countries. These are often called NIEs, or newly industrialized economies. Among our BRIC countries, that would be Brazil and Russia. Also examples of this type of country would be Chile, Venezuela, Mexico. And then finally, there are upper income countries, call it per capita income of 12,000 or more. These have very developed industries and very advanced infrastructure. US, Japan, France, Great Britain would fall into these categories. It might seem that less developed countries don't have a lot of opportunity for countries to go into, but that's not true at all. There definitely are marketing opportunities in LDCs because historically they've been characterized by a shortage of goods and services. So a lot of times companies are looking at long-term opportunities to nurture, in these areas. Some mistaken assumptions about LDCs. The poor have no money. They have less, but they have money. The poor will not waste money on non-essential goods. That's a personal consumption decision. Entering developing markets is fruitless because goods there are too cheap to make a profit. Not necessarily. People in bottom of the pyramid countries cannot use technology. That's not true at all. Technology is advancing very rapidly in there. Global companies doing business in bottom of pyramid countries will be seen as exploiting the poor. That is changing. That mindset is definitely changing. Many people are in favor of global trade, and so there's been a lessening of barriers to trade. The historic barriers to trade are things like tariffs, which are taxes on imports, quotas, which is a limit on the number of imports, and then the ultimate in quotas would be a limit of 0, and that's called an embargo. Two organizations that have been very, very strong advocates of global trade are GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which started in 1947, and more recently the WTO, the World Trade Organization. There are different levels of trade. So let's walk through the different levels of trade. The first would be a preferential trade agreement. Now, these are regional cooperation agreements. The next level would be a free trade area. Within a free trade area, there are no tariffs between the member countries. NAFTA, of course, would be a free trade area. But then there's the next level, customs union. There's the same thing, no tariffs between member countries, but they have common external tariffs to the outside. The next level up would be so-called common markets. In addition to no tariffs between member countries and common external tariffs, there's free movement of the factors of production. And the ultimate level would be an economic union, and the European Union would be a good example of this. In addition to all of the earlier things, they try to coordinate economic and social activity, social policy. For example, in the European Union, doctor licensing goes across country lines as well. Now, the European Union and NAFTA are the two biggest, most important regional trade agreements, but let's look at all of the major regional trade agreements. Again, in addition to the WTO, the World Trade Organization, other organizations that try to facilitate international trade include the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. NAFTA, of course, covers North America, the US, Canada, and Mexico. The European Union covers 28 countries in Western and Central Europe. Of course, the big news in the European Union is Brexit, or Britain's departure. MERCOSUR is a South American trade agreement. APEC covers the Asia-Pacific region. A much, much smaller trade agreement, SICA in the Caribbean area. The Andean Community covers some of the countries in Western South America. ASEAN covers Asian countries, but notice it doesn't cover a couple of the biggest economies there, China and Japan. The GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, has 6 largely oil-producing countries in the Middle East. Africa has several trade agreements. ECOWAS for Western Africa, the SADC for Southern Africa. So there's lots of agreements between countries and in regions to try to promote free trade. With regard to the biggest economies get together to discuss economic issues. The two biggest get-togethers are the G8 Council and the G20. Now, the G8, these are the 8 largest economies in the world, and that is the United States, Japan, Russia, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, and Canada. And then the G20 adds the next 12. The G20, if there are, call it 160 countries in the world as counted by several major organizations, the G20 represent the great majority of all economic activity. They represent 90% of global domestic GDP. They represent 80% of global trade. They've got 2/3 of the world's population. And those countries, in addition to the G8 countries, include Australia, Saudi Arabia, India, South Africa, Turkey, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia, and South Korea. So there's our G20 countries. Those are the major players that make up global trade. And that will do it for this module on global trade.